In the winter of 2009, Sable Doucette, a woman of 28 with hands already roughened from a decade of work she had chosen over comfort, was informed that the lake behind her family's maple farm was going to become a marina. She was not consulted. She was not invited to weigh in. She received a registered letter on a Tuesday morning in February, and the language inside it was the language of conclusion, not conversation. Let me tell you about the farm first, because you cannot understand what was at stake without understanding the land. The Doucette property sat on the eastern shore of Lac Sainte-Marthe, roughly 90 kilometers north of Ottawa in the Laurentian foothills. A place where the winters arrived without apology and stayed until they were good and ready to leave. Sable's grandmother had planted the first sugar maples in 1951, laid out in long patient rows that followed the contour of the hillside down to the water's edge. By the time Sable's mother passed the deed to her, those trees were thick and dignified, tapping beautifully, producing a syrup so clear and amber dark it looked like something poured from a cathedral window. The farm had a modest sugar shack, a small retail cabin open in spring, a century-old farmhouse with a wood stove that groaned pleasantly in the cold, and exactly 17 meters of shoreline on the lake. 17 meters. That detail mattered more than Sable knew. The letter was from a company called Meridian Shore Development, registered in Toronto. It informed her, in cordial but immovable language, that the provincial government had approved the conversion of Lac Sainte-Marthe's eastern corridor into a recreational marina and resort development. The project was called Sainte-Marthe Shores. It would include a 400-slip marina, a boutique hotel, 4 restaurants, a waterfront promenade, and a spa. Construction was to begin the following spring. Her property, the letter explained, sat within what the development plans described as the shoreline impact zone. She would experience increased boat traffic, noise, light pollution, and seasonal congestion. And, as a gesture of goodwill, Meridian Shore was prepared to offer her a generous acquisition package for the full Doucette property. There was a number at the bottom of the second page. Sable read it once. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She put on her coat and her grandmother's old work mitts, walked out to the sugar bush, and stood there for a long time among the maples in the February silence. They were not her trees. They were older than her choices, larger than her plans, deeper in the ground than anything a development company could measure in square footage or assessed value. She put her mittened palm flat against the bark of the largest one, a tree her grandmother had called Old Marguerite, though no one remembered why anymore. She went back inside and put the kettle on. The first meeting with the Meridian Shore representatives happened 6 days later in a rented room above the hardware store in the nearest town. Sable arrived in her truck, in a wool sweater and her barn boots, still carrying the cold smell of the sugar bush on her jacket. She arrived to find 3 men in pressed shirts who had driven up from Toronto that morning and had not yet managed to find a decent cup of coffee. The lead man was named Mr. Alderton. He had the air of someone who had done this particular meeting many times before in many small towns and had learned to calibrate his warmth precisely enough to be disarming without being dishonest. He shook her hand firmly and gestured to a chair as though it were his room and she were the guest. The other 2 were Mr. Bryce, who handled legal matters and said very little, and Mr. Pell, who was younger and kept a tablet open on the table with renderings of the finished marina, glossy and blue and full of sailboats and happy people in pale linen. "Miss Doucette," Mr. Alderton began, "we appreciate you making the time. We know this is a significant moment for a family property, and we want to handle this with real sensitivity." He went on for some minutes, He spoke of economic revitalization and tourism corridors and the long-term benefit to the region. He used the word partnership several times. He showed her a projected revenue map for the surrounding municipalities. He was, by any measure, good at his job. Sable listened. She had learned to listen from her grandmother, who had been a woman of spectacular patience. Her grandmother had always said that the most useful thing you could do in any room was wait until the other person had fully emptied themselves of words, because only then could you hear what they were actually afraid of. The offer stands at the number in the letter, Mr. Alderton said eventually, folding his hands on the table. It reflects fair market value plus a significant goodwill premium. We think it's a figure that allows you to move forward, to find something new, something easier, perhaps. Sable looked at him for a moment. My grandmother planted those trees in 1951, she said. The oldest ones tap at 40 years. We're still getting first-rate yield from trees she'll never see again. I'm not selling. Mr. Alderton's expression did not change. He had anticipated this. He adjusted slightly. We respect that deeply, but I want to be transparent with you. The Marina development is proceeding regardless. Your shoreline access will be significantly affected. Boat wakes, noise, increased traffic on the access road. It's going to change the character of the operation considerably. We're not saying this to pressure you. We're saying it because we believe you deserve to know what's coming. I appreciate that, Sable said. She stood, buttoned her coat. I'll manage. Mr. Pell looked up from his tablet with an expression that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. She drove home. The road north of town curved through a stand of white birch, and the afternoon light was coming through the trees at a low winter angle that turned everything golden and brief. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the 17 meters of shoreline. She thought about what it meant to own something that could not be moved. Now, let me tell you what it actually cost her. Because the months that followed were not cinematic. They were not a montage of quiet determination. They were hard in the specific, grinding way that hard things are when no one is watching. Construction on the Marina began the following April. The access road to the eastern shore, which ran within 200 meters of her sugar bush, became a haul route. Gravel trucks started at 5:30 in the morning. The vibration was constant enough that the old farmhouse windows rattled in their frames. A diesel generator ran through the night from the contractor's staging area. The lake, which had been quiet enough that you could hear loons from the sugar shack, was now loud with the percussion of pile drivers going into the lakebed. Her spring syrup season, the one season that sustained the whole year, happened in the middle of all of it. The tapping was fine. The trees did not care about the noise. But the retail cabin, which usually drew a steady stream of local families and day trippers up from the valley on weekends, saw its traffic cut by half. The access road was partially blocked for weeks at a stretch. People who had been coming to the Doucette farm for years simply could not get through or could not find parking when they did. That spring, Sable cleared 40% less than the year before. The women at the post office in town, who had known her since she was small, were kind but helpless. The men at the feed store shook their heads. There was a general quiet consensus in the community that Sable Doucette had made a sentimental choice and was now paying for it, that the sensible thing would have been to take the Meridian money and start fresh somewhere less complicated. They offered you enough to buy a new place outright, her neighbor told her one evening over coffee in her kitchen, meaning well. Maybe a bigger operation, fewer headaches. Sable nodded and poured more coffee. She did not tell him what she was thinking. She was not sure herself yet. It was still just a shape at the edge of her mind, not quite a plan. Let me tell you about the moment the shape became a plan. It happened in November of that year on a morning when the first real cold had come down from the north and the maple leaves had been gone for weeks, and the lake below the farm was the color of pewter under an overcast sky. The marina had opened that summer in soft launch, enough slips operational to welcome a few hundred boats. The hotel was still under construction, but the waterfront promenade was open, and on weekends it filled with people from Ottawa and Montreal, city people who arrived by car with expensive outdoor gear and an appetite for what the Regional Tourism Board was calling an authentic Laurentian experience. Sable had driven down to the promenade once, just to see it. She had walked along the new wooden boardwalk among the weekend visitors, who were drinking flat whites from a pop-up kiosk and taking photographs of the lake. The marina was handsome in a generic way. The hotel framing was tall and angular against the hillside. The sailboats looked exactly like sailboats in a brochure. A woman standing near the railing was pointing up the hill at something. Sable followed her gaze. From the promenade, the Doucette property was clearly visible. The old farmhouse set back in the trees, the long rows of maples running up the hillside, the small sugar shack with its metal roof catching the afternoon light. "What is that?" the woman said to her companion. "Old farm," the man said. "Sugar maple, I think." "It's beautiful," the woman said. "Not the marina, the farm." Sable drove home and stood in her kitchen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her younger cousin, a woman named Ottiline, who had studied hospitality management in Ottawa and was working a hotel front desk she hated. Sable asked if she wanted to come up for the weekend. Ottiline came up on Friday evening. They sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. They talked about what people actually wanted when they said they wanted to get out of the city. They talked about the difference between an experience that was manufactured to feel real and an experience that simply was real. They talked about maple syrup, about what it actually took to produce it, about how almost no one outside of farming communities had any idea. "How many people have asked you how it works?" Ottiline asked. Sable thought about it. A lot. Every spring, they come to buy a jar and they end up standing outside the shack for an hour asking questions. "And do you charge them for that?" "No, I just talk to them." Ottiline set down her mug. "What if you charged them for that?" The idea, once said aloud, was obvious in the way that only the right ideas are obvious. Simple, already present, just waiting for someone to name it. That winter, Sable built nothing. She had no money to build anything and no interest in debt. What she did instead was think carefully about what she already had. She had the sugar bush. She had the shack, which was weatherproof and warm and smelled of wood smoke and sweet steam. She had the knowledge of a family that had been doing this work for more than 50 years. She had, for the first time, a marina full of well-resourced people 2 kilometers down the road, looking for something to do that felt real. In February, she printed 30 cards on her home printer. They said, "Maple Season Experience. By appointment, Doucette Farm." She asked the owner of the general store in town, who also sold local arts and crafts, if she could leave a stack on the counter. She also, on a whim, left 10 cards at the marina office. The marina office called her the next morning. The first group came up on a Saturday in late March, when the sap had just begun to run. 6 people from Ottawa. A couple in their 40s, the man's parents, their 2 teenage children. They had spent the previous night at a hotel down near the promenade and had seen one of the cards in the morning. Sable met them at the gate in her grandmother's old work mitts and her barn jacket. She walked them into the bush. She showed them how to read a maple for readiness, the bark, the way the south side wept first, the pale, clear liquid that looked nothing like the dark syrup they bought in stores. She let them drill a tap hole themselves, 1 each, and fit the spile with their own hands. She told them about her grandmother, about the 1951 planting, about old Marguerite at the center of the grove. She walked them to the shack and showed them the evaporator, explained the ratio, roughly 40 liters of sap to produce 1 liter of finished syrup. She let them watch the boil. She let them taste from the ladle at different stages, thin and watery at first, then deepening, thickening, turning towards amber. When the first finished syrup of the season was ready, she poured it into small glass jars that had been warming by the wood stove. She handed one to each person. They stayed for 3 hours. They left having paid $120 each. They talked about it. Of course they talked about it. People who have had a real experience always talk about it. Within 2 weeks, Sable had 14 bookings for the remaining weeks of maple season. Within a month, she had turned people away. Now, let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever had the experience of offering something you considered ordinary, something you had always done, something your family had always done, and discovering that to someone else it was extraordinary, that the knowledge you carried in your hands, knowledge so familiar to you that it had become invisible, was the very thing someone else had driven 3 hours to find? That is what happened at Doucette farm in the spring of that year, and once it started, it did not stop. Word moved through the Marina community the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, going everywhere it wasn't invited. By the following year, Sable had structured 3 different experiences: the half-day tapping tour in maple season, a summer foraging and preservation workshop running through July and August, and in autumn a full-day harvest experience that included a supper in the farmhouse cooked on the wood stove, with produce from the kitchen garden and syrup from the current season's run. The autumn supper became its own thing entirely. It seated 12, one long table. Sable cooked, and her cousin Adeline, who had left the hotel job, managed the experience and the conversation. There was no menu because there were no choices. You ate what the land had produced that year. There was always maple-cured ham from a neighbor's hog. There was always a root vegetable soup. There was always the syrup in multiple grades and explanation of each. Guests arrived at dusk. They left past midnight. They were not strangers by the end. The dinner did not feel like a restaurant meal. It felt like being allowed into someone's actual life, which in fact it was. The Marina noticed in the way that organizations notice things, through numbers that refused to behave correctly. Bookings for slips midweek were consistent, but weekend day use at the Marina's own restaurant, a place called the Compass, with a waterfront terrace and an executive chef, began to dip on Saturday evenings. Repeat weekend visitors who had been through the Marina 3 or 4 times were rerouting. The Marina's restaurant manager mentioned it to the operations director. The operation director pulled the numbers. Saturday dinner covers at the Compass were down 11% from previous year. Someone mentioned the farm up the hill. Someone else had actually been. A junior staff member was dispatched discreetly to book the harvest supper and report back. She came back, as Sable would later learn, and said something that apparently unsettled the room. It's not really comparable. It's not competing with the Compass. It's doing something the Compass can't do. The operation director, a man named Mr. Devlin, who had been in resort hospitality for 20 years, and had the slightly compressed demeanor of someone who had solved a great many problems that did not stay solved, drove up the hill the following week to introduce himself. He was, to his credit, direct. He sat at Sable's kitchen table, accepted a cup of tea, and said, "We've been watching the interest in your operation with a lot of respect. We'd like to discuss some kind of formal relationship, partnership, referral arrangement, a package offering. We think there's something here that benefits both sides." Sable poured her own tea and considered him. He was not Mr. Alderton. He did not have the rehearsed warmth of an acquisition offer. He was genuinely curious and slightly at a loss, which she found more trustworthy. "What kind of partnership?" she asked. "We include your experience in our premium booking packages. We handle the reservation logistics on our end. We take a referral margin, you set your own pricing. Our guests get something they genuinely can't get anywhere else in this part of the province." He paused. "You'd stay completely independent. We have no interest in purchasing the property." We've learned from that conversation. Sable looked out the kitchen window at the sugar bush on the hillside, the rows of maples bare now in early November, their branches against a pale gray sky. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about what it meant to have built something that a corporation wanted access to, not ownership of. There was a distinction there that mattered enormously, though she took a moment to feel the full weight of it before she spoke. "I'll think about it," she said. She did think about it. For 3 weeks, she talked to Ottiline. She talked to a lawyer in town who had handled farm estates for years. She walked the sugar bush in the early morning frost, among the trees her grandmother had planted when Sable's mother was not yet born, and she thought about what her grandmother had understood that the development company had not. Her grandmother had once told her, late in her life, in the same kitchen, sitting at the same table, "People come up here thinking they want what the lake looks like, but what they actually want is to feel like they belong to something older than themselves. You just have to be patient enough to let them find it." The arrangement with the Marina was signed in January. Sable's terms were firm on every point that mattered. Full operational independence. No signage changes, no schedule interference with the natural rhythm of the farm, and a clause that allowed her to revoke at 90 days' notice for any reason. The Marina's premium Laurentian package now included a half-day at Doucette Farm as its centerpiece. Their highest-tier guests, the ones who had already been to Tuscany and Patagonia and were looking for something they hadn't already photographed, came up the hill, walked among the maples, sat in the sugar shack, ate at the farmhouse table, and left understanding, for the first time in some cases, where sweetness came from. The following spring, Sable received a letter. This one was handwritten on Meridian Shore Development letterhead, and it was from Mr. Alderton himself. He wrote, in a somewhat formal hand, that he had visited the region on an unrelated business matter and had taken the liberty of booking the harvest supper through the Marina. He said he owed her an honest admission. When they had met in that room above the hardware store, he had believed he was looking at a situation that time would resolve in his favor. He had believed with confidence that the noise and disruption would eventually produce the outcome he had offered her at the beginning. He had been wrong, he wrote. He recognized that now. Not because the farm had become successful, though it had, but because he understood finally what she had known from the beginning, that what she was protecting was not sentimental. It was foundational. It was the thing that made everything else in the valley worth visiting at all. He hoped she was well. He hoped old Marguerite was still producing. Sable read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the same drawer where she had put the original acquisition offer, the one with the number at the bottom of the second page, still unopened. She went out to the sugar bush. It was late afternoon in early March, the light coming low through the trees, the sap just beginning to think about moving. She put her palm against old Marguerite's bark, the same way she had, that first February, the day the registered letter arrived. The tree was warm in a way that made no sense given the temperature, or maybe it made every kind of sense. The Doucette farm still runs today. Sable is in her mid-40s now. She added nothing to the operation that she did not need. The harvest supper still seats 12. The waiting list runs 18 months. She has turned down 3 separate offers from lifestyle magazine features that wanted to scale the story, because the story, she explained politely each time, was not scalable. That was the point. Adeline is her full partner now. They hired one person part-time in the spring. The maples are older and producing beautifully. The marina has changed ownership once. St. Martha Shores is now in its 3rd management cycle, and its marketing materials, revised 2 years ago, led not with the marina's facilities or the hotel's amenities, but with a photograph of the Doucette sugar bush at sunrise, amber light moving through old trees. They never asked permission to use it. Sable noticed. She let it go. There is a girl now, Adeline's daughter, who is 7 years old and has been coming to the farm since she could walk. Last spring, Sable showed her how to read a maple for readiness, how to feel the bark on the south side, how to fit the spile, how to wait. The girl is patient, in the way that children are patient when they have been given something real to pay attention to. And if you go to the farm on a quiet afternoon in mud season, before the tourists arrive, before the marina opens for the summer, before the world gets loud again, you might see the two of them out in the sugar bush together. You might see Sable crouching down to show the girl something small and specific, her grandmother's old work mitts on her hands, her voice low, the steam beginning to rise from the shack behind them. The lake gray and still in the distance. The development company arrived with blueprints and a number on a page and the absolute certainty that they knew what this land was worth. They were not wrong about the land. They were wrong about what was on it.